Is that the document be noted. I call the member for Fremantle.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I agree with the member for Warringah and the member for North Sydney who spoke earlier. This is an important report. The committee has taken on a piece of critical work here because cats represent an enormous threat to Australia's environment. They are the cause of some of the most acute and widespread damage that has already occurred, and they are, in the words of one of the experts who appeared before the committee, often the final coffin as Australian species continue to go extinct. And so I guess I'd start by just pointing out that we have to see this report in that larger context. The starting part of the picture is extraordinary environmental damage. That's what has occurred in Australia, particularly over the last couple of hundred years. Cats have been a big part of that, and they continue to be a massive part of it. And then the third part of the picture, sadly, is that our environmental protection framework and the measures that we have been taking to try and, on the one hand, arrest harm, and on the other hand, perhaps in some cases restore environments or see populations come back to their former health. Those measures aren't working, and we must, above all, we must stop kidding ourselves about that fact. It is undeniable. On that point, you can't get a better statement than what the government-appointed EPBC reviewer Graham Samuels himself has said in his review of the EPBC, and I quote, "Australia's natural environment and iconic places are in an overall state of decline and are under increasing threat. The pressures on the environment are significant, including land use change, habitat loss and degradation, and feral animals and invasive plant species. The impact of climate change will exacerbate pressures and contribute to further decline. In its current state, the environment is not sufficiently resilient to withstand these threats. The current environmental trajectory is unsustainable." That's the reality as it is now. We've done enormous harm to our environment. We've seen some 30+ species go extinct already. We are sadly a world leader when it comes to mammal extinctions. If you compare Australia to North America as a comparator, we've had 30+ mammal species go extinct. North America has seen one. Cats, unfortunately, are a big part of that. They are an unparalleled slaughter machine when it comes to Australian mammals, birds, lizards and amphibians. 1.6 billion animals each year. A single feral cat on average kills 1,200 Australian animals a year. Even pet cats across Australia, taken all together, are responsible for killing collectively 1 million Australian native animals a day. So the largest impact is from feral cats, but unfortunately pet cats make a contribution as well. They are in many cases the greatest immediate threat to Australia's most endangered species, and we have a number of species that are on the brink, that are down to the last few hundred of their number, and it'll be the combination of climate change and bushfires coupled with cat predation that will see the end of some of those species if we don't do something. And we must do something different because what we're doing right now isn't working. I give the government credit. A few years ago they created the Office of the Threatened Species Commissioner. Now, it was a new initiative that was intended to have some beneficial effect on behalf of the most threatened species in Australia, which sadly there are many. But we have to acknowledge now, 3 years on, that it's not working. It's not working on its own terms. It set some very clear targets. Those targets are not being met. It chose, for example, 20 particularly threatened mammal species with the target by the end of the first period, the 3-year period, to see an improvement in population numbers for 10 of those 20 species. That has not occurred. What we've seen over 3 years so far is a population increase for only 4 of those 20 mammal species, while for another 4, an improvement is claimed to the extent that the rate of decline has slowed. That cannot be good enough. If we set these targets, if we create these bodies, we must expect that they deliver the outcomes that they've been set up to deliver. And along the way, when that doesn't occur, we need to ask why. We need to be prepared to add programs and add resources to get what we need. Because if we don't, of those 20 mammal species and the threatened bird species and amphibian species, we will simply see more extinctions. You cannot take what is happening in terms of the impact of cats outside of the broader environmental picture, and as the member for Warringah just pointed out, the government's actions in this space in protecting the environment are nothing to be proud about. You cannot cut 40% from the Department of the Environment when the environment has been smashed and the trajectory is one of decline. You take 40% of the funding for the department that's responsible for that away, and you expect things to get better. You're operating according to a different logic than the one I understand should be applied in this space. You can't have a situation where 79% of decisions made under the EPBC involve failures of compliance and failures to meet basic conditions, as the Auditor General's report found. You can't have, as Graham Samuel has found, an environmental protection framework at the Commonwealth level that doesn't have effective national standards, that is allowing the net loss of habitat for critically endangered species, that is allowing, as we've seen reported today by The Guardian, double dipping when it comes to the use of offsets. The destruction of habitat, which is supposed to be balanced out by the acquisition of some offset territory that includes equivalent habitat, that's being used multiple times to allow destruction of habitat for multiple projects. I mean, that simply cannot be the case. So this report, I think that on a collegiate bipartisan basis, looks very clearly at what the reality will be if we don't act. And the reality will be further environmental degradation and the loss of more species, and therefore the irreversible loss of biodiversity in Australia. We can't accept that. We just cannot accept that. So I do hope that the government pays close attention to the report and the recommendations, which are the basis of a lot of expert testimony and wide engagement with stakeholders around Australia. We've urged the government to prioritise the problem of feral cat control in proper balance with other programs. There are issues like wild dogs, for instance, in rural and regional Australia, and we know that that's a problem particularly for primary producers, but it's hard to understand why the funding that goes to wild dog control is so far in excess of the funding that goes to feral cat control. That kind of question has to be answered. The threatened species strategy needs to be seriously revised. The government has responded to the failure of the strategy so far by doing what governments often do and what make people in the community extremely cynical. They've said, well, rather than operating over 5 years, why don't you operate over 10 years? We'll just kick the can down the road. We'll just expand out the scope of your work, and we won't give you any additional resources. Clearly, there needs to be better collaboration with the states and territories. There needs to be greater investment in scientific research and technology. We don't have a broad-scale method for handling cats, as other speakers have mentioned. At the moment, we don't have a way of eliminating cats in the way that we have been able to do to some degree with other invasive species. Until we do, we have to ensure that feral cats in particular don't push the most threatened animals and birds and lizards and amphibians over the brink, over the edge. And the best way we can do that is, as the member for North Sydney pointed out, really significantly expanding the network of exclosures and offshore islands. It's sad, it is very, very sad that Australia is in a position where the best we can do is put fences around species, eradicate cats within those species as a sort of a life raft to get them through the next decade or so while we search for something like gene drive technology. But if we don't do that to a greater degree than we're doing now, more mammals will go extinct and other animal species as well. I was part of the committee's trip to Mulligan's Flat, and that was a real eye-opener. Scientists in this space talk about not just actual extinction, but the extinction of experience. Unfortunately, many Australians would go for a walk in the bush and see virtually no animals and think, well, this is Australia. It's a harsh landscape. there are just not that many animals around, or perhaps they're hiding. That isn't true. Our country used to be full of animals. They used to be everywhere until we destroyed it. And we have an opportunity to stop that destruction, but the government needs to get the report, pay attention to it, and respond with the kinds of measures that it calls for.